time. So great to be here, and basically I'm just going to talk about towns, town centres, and my role in the Heritage Council. So I set up a programme called the Collaborative Town Centre Health Check Programme, and I just want to sort of say a wee bit about what we do. So firstly, I just want to say as well, my love for towns I think came about because I grew up in the north during the Troubles. And as a child, you know, as a teenager, whatever, we would have like, you know, steel sort of fences around all our towns, around all our city centres. So, you know, when we went shopping, it was quite an experience, you know, because you had to sort of stand like this and you'd be searched while you were talking. So I think that made it very clear to me as a kid that, you know, sometimes if you didn't care about your town centre, or if you didn't have the right people in place who were looking after your town centre, your city centre, that they, you know, could die. So yeah, then just fast forward, I suppose, after that early age experience, they say that everything, you know, you bring with you in your life. So I suppose then fast forward to 2016, and business people started coming to me in the Heritage Council and asked me, could I help? Was there anything that we could do? Was there anything that I could do? I had actually set up the Irish World Towns Network. I know Kilmallock's not too far away from here, so I had set that up and run it for 4 years until we got a project manager. And wrote that action plan as well, and we got 4 million for 2 years to do lots of projects. So as I say, I've had a love of town centres. So yeah, it was the business people who really came to me first, the civic leaders, and they were basically, you know, just really wanting to help. They weren't sort of seeing it, they weren't seeing any policy, there wasn't any national policy. So I suppose really what I wanted to emphasise is that I cared, they cared, we were all trying to do something, knowing that there was no policy at a national level. So yeah, but the thing was, in that first year I had no funding. So I basically went around the country asking people in the universities and the ITs would they work with me. So that first year for me, you know, it's a programme that I'm really proud of because of that fact. And also just to highlight that all the good people that I met or had known and had been working with for quite a few years in those universities and the ITs, you know, when I asked them, listen, I don't have a budget, I can't pay you. The most common answer was, if it's for the good of the country, I'll do it for free. And I always love saying that because it just shows you that there's so many good people out there in communities all around our country who are trying to sort of get change and you know, progress and things like that, who are trying to battle away at that. So yeah, if it's for the good of the country, I'll do it for free. So that really gave me hope, emboldened me. I just kept going. Basically, I'm a bit nuts that way. And also, I should say as well, my late father was a university lecturer, so I've always had a great love of academics. I think they do a great, you know, sort of service in terms of the creative juices in our country, intellectual juices. So yeah, now basically we have 15 towns in the programme. We have 70 partners. I just want to say that those are the people who didn't sit back. Those are the people who, you know, with myself, battled through the blockers, the blockages, and we just kept going. All right, so basically in terms of what I believe in is collaboration. So I have worked for over 20 years with community groups. I wrote a toolkit back in 2012 for community leaders, civic leaders. You know, that's really what gets me up in the morning. I believe in collaboration. So yeah, the Collaborative Town Centre Health Check Programme, as you were saying there, Declan, I did a podcast. I've never actually done a podcast before. Lockdown happened. I had no idea how to do double tracking, blah, blah, blah. But anyway, it was a steep learning curve, really, really enjoyable. So I did a podcast series called Putting Town Centres First. That was before Town Centre First came out. We started lobbying for Town Centre First in 2019. It was put into the programme for government. The beauty about the podcast was that, you know, it really, I suppose, built that collaboration internationally. So the Irish diaspora started to get in touch as well, which was nuts for me. I was getting lovely messages December 2020 over Christmas, you know, from people in Vancouver and Japan, Irish people, you know, who really want to help as well. So it's just amazing the amount of people who want to help, and I suppose are looking, you know, at what's happening in the country in terms of maybe being held back. So yes, the first project that we got over the line was Tralee. So that was the Collaborative Town Centre Health Check. That was that first year we did Tralee. We launched it a few months later. Tralee won Most Enterprising Town in Ireland award. The following year then we did Letterkenny, then a few months later Letterkenny won Most Enterprising Town in Ireland award. I had high hopes for Dundalk in 2019, but the local authority put in a different town. So that was the end of our run, and then obviously COVID hit. So yeah, basically what I really want to say is we're just going to keep going round in circles and circles if we don't do collaboration. You know, it's about power, it's about synergy, it's about empowerment of people. And lastly, just to talk about democratisation of data. So everything that I do in terms of trying to create and map the data, everything that I'm trying to do is to add public value, to make sure that communities have the data that they don't have at the minute. And what we've done recently is launch the Tipperary one. So Hopefully you've got some copies of that on your seats or whatever. So that was a few weeks ago. That's the first baseline for Tipperary Town. It's been really, really interesting because it's got a very, very high vacancy rate, and that's one of the key things. I do 15 steps with the community leaders and business leaders, and what we're trying to do is identify what is your vacancy rate so that I can see where is this town in terms of how it's performing. So if we just give the European target as 5% ground floor retail in town centres, and what we found with Tipperary is 31.2%. We've just finished another town, the West Farm, which has a ground floor vacancy rate of 45%. And then the upper floors, I mean, they're even worse. They're up around 80%. So yeah, as I say, I started calling for town centre first in 2019. That was after Tralee, that was after Letterkenny. And then organised a workshop where the Scottish came over. So as I say, the Scottish Towns Partnership, Scotland's Towns Partnership, that's run by an Irish person as well. Again, all the Irish people just started to emerge, there's so many people out there trying to help us. So Town Centre First was published in February of this year, but unfortunately it doesn't actually have any targets in it, which would have been the first thing that I would have put into it. So it's going to be very hard to sort of, I suppose, get the resources you're trying to drive down that vacancy. Yeah, so again, just to really emphasise, it's about democratisation of data, okay? It's about so that community groups understand, how the data can be used. It's also about making sure that policymakers don't hide, that there's no hiding place and that they're accountable. That the vacancy rates are not normal. Our vacancy rates are completely out of kilter with what other European countries are doing. And just to say as well, so I have 50 plus towns on the waiting list, and I don't have the resources that I need. I don't have a team. I was promised a team by this government, but that hasn't actually happened yet. And the resources in terms of funding needs to happen as well. So yeah, again, I'm working with the Irish Region's European office in Brussels, and they're just saying to me, just keep going, it's exactly what the country needs. And the Danish government's been in touch now last week because they're loving the model, they've heard about it as well. So yeah, 3 key messages just to really say, we need to care about our towns, and say I'm absolutely passionate about towns and communities, because you don't have towns without people. So it really is about people in place. And also we need to collaborate. That is a fundamental for me. It's a reason, as I say, why I do what I do. I wouldn't actually do anything unless I could collaborate. I think I would retrain as a yoga teacher or something. It is through me like a stick of rock. And also just say it's about the democratisation of data. It's so important that we do this for our country. Developed countries have data and we need to keep going. So that's it really. Thank you very much. Great to be here. Okay, over to you.
How are you? Richard Ludlam was my name. Born in Bennock, this side of Bruff. Moved to Drumnaglaca, the other side of Bruff, when I was 9 years of age. And I grew up. To me, it was Bruff, Kilmallock and Crewe were our centres when we were growing up as young children. And whether you were going to Ballion, to the disco, whether you were going to Bullen, this was our centre. The first drink I ever had was actually here in Bruff, a pint of Smitty's, below an Ann Butler's in Bruff, up the alleyway into the pool table, and that was where I had my first.
You told me you were at least 18, right?
I cannot confirm or deny.
It's being recorded.
But it was, at the time when I grew up, I started out in construction. I was also involved in politics, and I was a member of a party. And as I grew, even within the party myself, I was within the Fianna Fáil party. And I felt like I was being held back every time I turned. I was being held back. You couldn't say this and you couldn't say that. So I made a decision to go independent. I must say it's probably one of the best decisions I've ever made in my life, because it lets me be true for Limerick that I love. And I love Limerick. I love everything about Limerick, but the only thing that makes me cross is the lack of funding development within Limerick. So from my construction background, I look at towns and villages. For the likes of Bruff to grow, you need infrastructure. So everything I do is based on how can I get Bruff, Kilmallock, Crewe back up to where it's vibrant, where people want to go, where people want to live. That's my job. Now, I don't mind if anyone else within a party delivers it. My job is to take the voice of Limerick and County Limerick to Dublin and show up for years what we've been asking to get to be done in our towns and villages, and it hasn't been delivered. So, as I say, I'm from a business background. My father was farming, My mother was a housewife, my mother was from Clough, from Drumkeen. They were the strongholds for me of growing up. And they gave me what I could help them people deliver. I'm an early school leaver, and I have education of life. What do I surround myself with? With people from education of different sectors. Once we all have the same thing in common, that we're all moving forward. Education is not for everyone. Education to know that you can lean on somebody that knows something different and ask them, that's the way forward. From the young people to older people, we've got to get the connections right. So we'll just use Bruff when I grew up. And what I've seen here now to what was there when I was young isn't there anymore. What can rebuild Bruff, which it has, is massive community, a massive community spirit, and they have that. What is missing is infrastructure. So for people that want to move here, they have to have connectability, whether it's to the schools, so a feeder schools, the primary school to secondary school, from transport from here to work, sewerage systems, water systems, which allows people to build houses and come back home if they want to live in the town or outside the town. Planning permission is a big one in our areas. That all comes back to infrastructure. And if we don't have infrastructure, nothing can grow. So that is my job that I feel as a TD, is to get infrastructure back into our areas, into our villages. If you put in infrastructure, your population rises. If your population rises, you then have a study that you can show that I have extra people, I can now justify transport and using transport in different sectors. Everyone in this room wants to play their part from the point of view of environment. Everyone wants to do it. But at present, there is no infrastructure for a lot of people that have no other choice but to use a vehicle. And what I look from within government, and I had a conversation on this during the week, and it's the perception of what's in government, what their perception is based on a city-based cabinet. And that's what I'm trying to break. So they have told us that we said, on the VAT on fuel. They said the higher the fuel goes, the higher the VAT that they take. And Pascal Dunn, who said to me the other day that, and it's actually live on television, it's recorded, that he said that we are taking higher VAT on fuel. But he said, when it comes to the citizens, and his exact words were, when it comes to the citizens that no longer are in a position to support the shops or the local economy, we're taking less funding there. What he doesn't understand is, by taking the higher rate and tax on VAT on fuel, he's targeting everyone in rural Ireland that has no transport, that have no choice but to use a car, or a tractor, or a truck, or a van for all our deliveries. They're taking it off of rural Ireland, where there's no infrastructure. So we're being double taxed for something where they should have looked at, maybe people would spend more in the shops if we spread the load. And that means it's costing more to produce because of the higher taxation on fuel. It's costing more to transport your goods because it's costing more on fuel. Everything, the whole common denominator is actually fuel. But they look at it that you have to pull to the pump, you have to fill, they're taking the money at source. But they're only taking it from a rural Ireland setting. So, for me, that's one. And I'm trying to bring this from, I want our cabinet and government to represent the whole country. Whether you're from a city, whether you're from a town, a village or rural area, we should have balance on our cabinet. If you have balance on your cabinet, you have balance across the country. Then you get funding for the towns and villages. Then they realise the infrastructure that's needed. Do you understand that if you do not have infrastructure and you have no other choice but to use a vehicle, they should understand that too, but they don't. And the government at the moment have never had as much money in the coffers now as they ever did, because they're taking it at source. But the knock-on effect is that people now are going to the shops where they were getting 2 bags of groceries and they were spending €100 in the shop. They're now coming out with €100 in 1 bag. The shopkeeper has a rise in wages, insurance, across the board, everything rises. And the business people are trying to protect their employees. The employees are saying that we're not getting enough money because inflation has gone up. But the government are actually driving inflation because of their lack of understanding of a whole country, of what they're doing by targeting one particular few. And they have the toolbox, and they were given the toolbox by Europe that they could actually address this. But they won't address it because they've never seen as much funding coming in at source that they don't have to go after on other sectors or after business. They're taking it at the pumps. So I will work with anyone that wants to deliver for Limerick, for Ireland. I will be educated by people that would have a different outlook that might come in par with my one, and we'll all move forward. But my job as an independent, and I will always stay independent, because as I say, I do love Limerick. I do love the country, and I want to live in the countryside. Not everybody wants to live in the city. But I want infrastructure. I want equality for everyone, so we can all move forward together. And everyone that has their own cultures. And I'll finish up with this. I do an awful lot with groups of people that raise funds for charities or individual people. And we go to vintage, and people look at me, vintage, vintage, vintage. What is vintage? Vintage is a celebration of our past. It's where men and women come together and they have artifacts from their years gone by that were used, and they've shown what had been modernised, but they're still looking back, and it gives them something to talk about with what they grew up with in their youth. It also does a massive thing from a social point of view. Nearly every Sunday there's something from vintage. What does it do? People that have lost their partners, whether it was male or female, people who are living alone, our families that want to go out and meet and talk about something that they all enjoy talking about together. It's a meeting place for all ages, whether you're young or old, it doesn't matter. And the grandchildren come, the teenagers come, and the people that have, and there's all the different range of vintages from different people. So we have young people that come up with modern machinery to vintage run. And I encourage them to come, because in 20 or 30 years' time, that's going to be the vintage of the future. But you have to bring the young people with you, embrace them, because in 20, 30 years' time, they'll be sitting where I am and trying to encourage other people to begin to keep our rural areas, keep everything together. So it's actually a training program for people that will drop it into the back of their heads, and eventually it will come forward, and when they go through life, they will actually have something that they can give back themselves, and they have memories, they have education, but they're also giving a sense of community that where somebody can actually come together and work together of all ages, and everyone is equal. So I don't know everything, and the little bit you learn after the bit you know is the bit that counts, and nobody knows everything. I'm willing to learn. I'm willing to work with whoever wants to work with me, once we're all going in one direction for the betterment of rural Ireland, rural Limerick, rural, every part of it. So if I can help, and I will change different ways to help, and I will get a different train of thought, and I will be educated to different sectors. But once we all have the same goal, we're moving forward, that we want to save rural Ireland. I get up then in the morning and I don't go to work because I love what I'm doing. I love helping. And when I look at the community that's around us, what they want to do is help as well. It actually makes my job, it's not a job, it makes my life easier. It gets me up in the morning, and I want to go out knowing that there's people out there that love what they're doing, that love to help, and not everyone has a good day. And when you go out and you start off your day that you're starting good, you'll actually encourage other people that yes, tomorrow's coming, it's going to be better. We now have something that we can work forward for the future. So thank you very much. Sorry, can I just say one small thing? And Declan, I meant to say it at the very start. You sat up here at the start and you said to me that you were nervous. That's not nerves. That's passion. And that's something everyone in this room should recognise. It's not nerves, it's passion. And well done to everyone that organised this.
Thanks very much. I think it's really clear that the sort of passion that we all feel. I mean, it really does enthuse us and emboldens us. John, obviously you've been through a lot in terms of.
I'm feeling very nervous here at the moment.
In terms of the recession, you were at the helm of the Department of Finance. I mean, your experience. It's great to have you here today. So, do you want to share your story with us?
Yeah, well, I won't say too much because then we might just more do Q&A or something like that. I mean, I'm sure you have questions about here, but I do want to talk about Declan in just to embarrass the man a bit, and sort of, because he epitomises to me what places like Brough need, which is the ability to sort of understand their own situation and reach out to people to try and get them to help, because ultimately every town in Ireland needs to find a way to stitch into the system, and whether it's through the local authority or national government or more importantly, my suggestion to him was to get Ali to Brough. And so, because as far as I'm concerned, from what I've seen amongst all the people I interacted with, whether it was at the Department of Housing or other departments while I was at the Land Development Agency, I don't think there's anyone in Ireland that understands towns better than she is. And my point was that if you could convince her to come to Brough, then Brough gets on her radar, and she can apply some of the skills that are there. The third element, of course, which is where he and all the other organisers in these kind of events are so great, is that the town itself needs to want to move on the direction. So having a community strength, and I know Richard referred to it, the strength of the community here, with everybody, going back to Ali's point about collaborating across the system, is really important. The fourth thing I wanted to say, though, that I think is really important, if you've got all of those elements together, is that it is up to each town, Brough being one, to also decide what it wants to be. And this is really important, because nobody from outside should tell a community what they should want to be. It should really be facilitating what that community wants to be. But with some important criteria, which is, sometimes I think towns will look back in the past and try and recreate the past, and I don't think that's possible, nor indeed is it necessarily the right thing. We're going through one of the most existential crises that the world has faced in terms of climate breakdown, and there will be winners and losers in that, and actually the winners, I think, will be the towns that leap forward and embrace that. Ireland is a laggard in this in a tremendously disappointing way, and we need to try and find a way to jump into that, and ideally I would love to see Limerick take the lead on this, across the board, and then each town to play its own role. What does that mean? Well, the first thing is, it may mean that for some towns it's not a case of looking at the population in 1940 or 1960 and saying we've declined and we need to grow bigger. Actually, population growth itself is a very dangerous measure of success, because first of all, it can put, if it's not very well planned, it can put an undue strain on the very things that make a place a nice place to live. Schools become overcrowded, the one remaining pub becomes overcrowded, the social services that are there. And so if a town has decided that it needs to grow, or wants to grow in that, I think it's really important that they come up with and work with the system to have a longer term perspective on what that could mean. People may have picked up on a podcast I did recently with Matt Cooper, another Limerick example of where things are just so wrong at the moment compared to that town's potential, is the town of Foynes, right? So the councillors in Limerick, and I know there are some here, but and others have looked at the development plan for Limerick, but only looking at it over 5 or 6 years, because that's kind of what the Department of Housing are telling them to do. The outcome of that development plan, applying these national rules to all these towns, is that Foynes is anticipated in the next 6 years to grow, I think it's by 50 households, of which only 15 are in the actual town. The other 85% are actually stuck in presumably one-off housing around Foynes, so it's not really contributing to Foynes. Now, the inconsistency of that with the other decisions that's been made around Foynes, where the port is investing several hundred million in the redevelopment of the port, the government have agreed to be implemented by the local authority to put almost €500 million worth of infrastructure in transport to get trains going to Foynes and to get a new road going all the way to Foynes. So just to me is just, if I have any concern, it is this disconnect between all these various things that are happening at a time when Limerick is supposed to be growing its population by something like 75,000 people. But you think back to the time of Brendan O'Regan and those, where people were able to look at the arrival of Shannon Airport into Shannon and the idea of building a whole new town around that. So if you kind of draw these little bits together, what you find is that for a town like Foynes, the trajectory is completely different than the trajectory for Kilmallock or Bruff or Abbeyfield or others. And each community has to kind of do a job of analysing that. But my exhortation is that they don't do it over 5 years. You know, think forward 20 years, 30 years, and see what that looks like. And in that context, identify the infrastructure that can make a difference. Another example is Adair, right? Which has probably done a pretty good job of defining what we think of Adair as a town. It's relatively well known across the whole country for certain things. But it has the potential to change very dramatically if the train that goes to Foynes and that line starts stopping in Adair for residential purposes and carrying people in and out of Limerick. Now all of a sudden Adair has this question to ask whether it wants to become a very significant commuter type town for Limerick, or whether it wants to kind of grow itself and use this train infrastructure as a structure around which to build, but potentially building to one side of Adair rather than maybe even the side it has thought about developing before, potentially bringing in much higher density accommodation into Adair than the typical Adair house that we're probably so familiar with, which has a large garden and multiple bedrooms, you know. And I do think that it's really important that the towns, and that's where Ali's work is so incredibly good, because as she said, you focus on data. You know, the most important and the most dangerous thing is when people start making decisions based on emotion rather than on evidence. It was like this 30 years ago, it was like that 40 years ago, without actually analysing what is really happening now and stuff like that. If there are the vacancy levels that there are, which I suspect is true for Foynes, or for Bruff, if we look at it as well, an analysis of what the solutions could be. You know, what could the uses be? The town of, the city of New York have an incredibly interesting approach to some of these things in their neighbourhoods, and ultimately neighbourhoods and communities are whether they're in urban spaces and towns or those are very similar. And they totally hand in glove use the planning system to achieve objectives that make sense. So they don't let the developers or individuals decide how this all pieces together. They come up with a plan for a neighbourhood, and even to the point where, and we all think of New York as big sort of tall skyscrapers, but actually the average height in many of the neighbourhoods is much smaller and is restricted, so you can't go that much higher. But what they allow then is in these conversations, is they may say to a developer, you can go 2 extra floors on your building, but we take the bottom floor for the next 10 years. And then they give that to SMEs and to other industries at a relatively low rent, might be even less than $100 a month, with a competition for who wants to set up the bakery, who wants to set up the fishmonger. And all of this stuff is analysed with evidence as to what facilities do they need in that town in order to make it happen, and then subsidising that with a kind of an overall plan. And I think that's really important. The last thing I'll probably mention quickly, and Richard probably and I might have different views on this, right, is that Irish towns, and indeed rural Ireland, and first of all, by rural Ireland I now mean the Elizabethan definition, which is the urban part is the Pale, and everything else outside is rural Ireland, you know, in the context of government in Dublin. And so whether that's Myross, whether it's Bruff, whether it's Ate, or other towns across the country, I think they all struggle with the same issues. And that issue is the over-concentration of power and funding into the decision makers in the capital. And that has to change, and it's one of the reasons why I campaigned so strongly about the directly elected mayor for Limerick, and indeed for Waterford, for Cork, but sadly they didn't follow. Because I can't see another catalyst that allows us to change that, other than the DEM. the office of the DEM in Limerick, just to give some sense of the stats. So I say that in context of being appalled every time I see a TD or a Minister of Government in particular come out to celebrate giving €1,000 or €14,000 or €15,000 to a town in Ireland, whether it's tidy towns or whatever it is, because that should not be their job. If they focused on the bigger picture, the country may actually be in a better place. And so from my perspective, having thought about this a lot and having looked at other countries that work well, and you mentioned Denmark a minute ago, by contrast to Denmark as an example, Irish local authorities spend, I think it's something like 7% of national spending. Now, I'd love to be back as Department Secretary General again, because when I was there we were taking billions out of the system. As you know, we were taking 2 or 3 billion every year, and it was considered to be major austerity. In the 10 years since I was there, the Department of Finance now allocates to DPER, the Department of Public Expenditure, over 30 billion more a year than we had to spend in 2012 and 2013. Now that is effectively 50% more spending. I mean, you obviously it's way more money. But it is total madness to be waiting on people in meeting rooms in Dublin to decide on allocations of spending of even a million or two, let alone 15,000 here or 20,000 there, and this little inevitable conversation that will have to happen to say, when we look down along it, have we had enough for Donegal, have we had enough for rural Limerick, or we'll have Richmond on our case? Like, that shouldn't just be happening. It's a waste of incredible energy in our system. Limerick has a budget in the council, Bridget will probably correct me if I did it wrong, but in round terms, it's 250 million to be spent in Limerick. We think it's $1 billion, but actually 750 million of that is spent on rent and the centralised rental scheme. It's about €1,000 per person in Limerick. Right? Now, so Ireland is spending 7% through the local governments, and you can see how that breaks down to €1,000 per person in Limerick. In Denmark, closer to 65% of national spend is distributed and allocated by the local authorities, right? Which would represent 10 times more budget in Limerick. And that would be decisions around stuff, which would mean that when Ali would come into town to try and help Ross, she wouldn't have to be trying to convince some official in the Department of Housing to give her funding for 2 or 3 people and probably somebody who's never been to Bruff. You know, maybe not even been to Limerick, let alone to Bruff, right? Making a decision around the allocation of priorities, whereas that decision should be made with our local councillors here in Limerick. And so for me, a system that works well follows a model that's much more European, where actually Richard doesn't need to be fighting for Limerick, because that's done at the level of the local authority in a single thing. You probably have one single shot, which is to make sure that Limerick does get its fair share of this national allocation of much more funding. But after that, the implementation of whether it goes to Bruff, whether it goes to Foynes, whether it goes to Ate or Adair or wherever, should happen within the local councillors, so they deal with the local implementation. The people of Bruff talk to them, they argue probably with the mayor and with the CEO so they get the local allocation. But it all happens when we know what the answers should be, and we can kind of work out the right solution locally, and if necessary, we can chat to the people in Clare and Tipperary and kind of agree the stuff at the boundaries if they equally have that situation. So I think it's going to be a while before we get that type of devolution of power. I can see the resistance already in the last 3 years of waiting for the legislation to come out. It's not there for any reason other than people in Dublin don't want it to happen, and they're trying their best to stop it, and we need to be advocates for that. And the main reason to be advocates for it is the only way to change the system, to actually get to this position where we have those proper decisions. Healthcare gets decided locally, transport, you know, all of those decisions get decided locally here. And I think if we can start to push forward on that, we can actually start to break this cycle, which has meant that power goes back into centralised government. I've likened it to effectively when we inherited the power at the government system in Ireland, we inherited it from the Brits, who didn't trust the Irish to run their own affairs. And so power was centralised in Whitehall. Even they figured out that they need a levelling up agenda and they need to devolve stuff to other parts of the United Kingdom and potentially to Scotland and others. we took their system and we've made it more Irish than the Irish themselves to sort of, you know, by centralising it more power into each central government, and that needs to break. And I think only with that happening, then do we actually get this. And Richard then can stay on excise duties and things that are national level issues that have a local impact by explaining the local impact of those when the national policy is decided. But all the rest of the funding and the implementation and the bribing of Alan to get involved and giving her resources should happen locally.
Thanks very much. So on that positive note, I suppose really what we're talking about is participation and empowerment. So those are kind of the words that I'm using with the community groups that I'm working with. I also think with the Danish and the European model, it's much more dynamic. It's much more progressive. So like for me, it takes ages for somebody to answer an email. You know, the whole system has it's so sluggish, I think, and it's really, yeah, and it's also frustrating people like myself who are really, I came from the private sector into this job, you know, I'm not used to being sort of held back, you know, you're meant to time is money kind of thing. So can I just ask a question from the group? In terms of planning, you know, has anybody had a good experience with planning? Because like my belief is that planning is meant to, you know, make lives better. And what I'm finding in Ireland is that planning, you know, has anybody ever asked you to be involved in a plan, in a framework, you know, a vision for your town? Has that ever happened yet?
We have a community development plan We have a community development plan in Bruff that we did with Ballyhora, and we have a public realm plan that we did with the community council. With loads of plans, we'd like to see some action.
Okay, do you have like a groups, you know, you've got your tidy towns obviously, how do you envisage implementing those plans that you have?
Well, we have plenty of groups. We have the Heritage Group here, we have a community council, a very active one, we have a tidy towns, and I think probably more cooperation between them would send us forward better. Now, I'm not saying there isn't, there is, and it's progressing, but people need to talk to each other more and talk to the council more. And okay, we've a number of problems. We've had a number of problems. This was our county library that went to Kilmallock. We had a light industry out the road there. That's now Carebright. We had a secondary school. That's now a Ukrainian accommodation centre. So the Bank of Ireland, fingers crossed, and hopefully will be a digital hub. Is that right, Richard? Yeah. So when we lose something, we try and work hard to get something else in, but it's a constant battle, fighting the whole time. But your question was, is there planning? Lots of planning. Okay. More action.
On the ground. Well, I think on that point there, you know, I suppose really the 3 C's in community development, you know, collaboration, cooperation, coordination. I mean, I can't say those enough times that you have to find those civic leaders. And I mean, when I go into a town, the first thing that I have to, Damien English was asking me this a few years ago, like what's the first thing that I do? After counselling some of the local authority people who are actually, you know, some of them want to do good work and they're being held back as well. So I spend quite a bit of time counselling local authority staff. I feel sometimes, you know, that is what I spend the first 3 months doing, because they're sort of frustrated with the system as well. I think we're all frustrated with the system at this stage, so I mean, clearly something has to change. But that collaboration, that cooperation, you know, I have to find the civic leaders, you know, I have to find the really good civic leaders. You know, in Tipperary, we've got Councillor Anne-Marie Ryan. You know, in Feather, there's just an amazing group of people in Feather who I've been working with for over 10 years. Their vacancy has gone way down. In Dundalk, I'm thinking we've got a business improvement district. You know, with the town councils leaving the towns, being shut down, being abolished, you know, I would have preferred as a citizen that something else was ramped up at that time. So I do see a deficit, a sort of democratic deficit in our towns, and I'm trying to sort of step in and help that. So, Richard, would you have any thoughts about sort of, you know, how do we make it, you talked about as well, John, the local democracy, you know, how do we make sure people participate like they do in Denmark and Holland?
The biggest thing I see is from, again, and I used vintage as a section, but I said that you get it involved from the earlier ages. And if you have to make something even fun and get 1 or 2 younger people involved, it'll be a slow process, but you get younger people with all the different ages, it actually then creates interest in an area. But to rebuild the likes of Bruff and Kilmallock and all these, a lot of the issue is actually down to the planning laws. And a lot of the issue was down to historical listing of buildings and no funding there to fix the buildings. And then people look at the buildings and say, it's not viable for me to do up this building because I can't do it up because of the cost of it. I actually came up with something there recently where you have actually iconic buildings. Now I actually rebuilt the new credit union in Kilmallock. I'm a contractor, I'm a building contractor all my life. So we've done the credit union. It took 8 or 9 months longer because of the listing within the building. And there was buildings left and right of me that were actually falling down, that we were looking to see what people invest in them, and now some people have started investing. But we had houses within areas that the houses were listed. The houses were falling down, people were allowed to extend onto the back of the house, but we had a problem with insurance. The insurance company wouldn't insure the front of the house, but they'd insure the new piece in the back of it. And then what I came on, for buildings that are not iconic, we keep the front facades, we keep the roof structure, but the likes of houses that we want to get people back into houses, into towns or villages, that they leave the front wall and keep the front facades and the roof structure. Then they should be allowed to take out the other parts of it and rebuild it back into new. But the iconic buildings, the likes of the libraries and things like that, we keep them because they're historical, that everyone wants to see them in their form of glory, that will be used by public. Well, if we want to get people into our towns and villages, we've got to look at relaxing some of the laws that we can actually rebuild. And the other thing is, over the shops. Most people won't look at over shops at the moment because of regulations and insurances that are involved from businesses if they have people living upstairs. The fire planning for fires. Everything then has to be 1 hour fire doors, has to have a separate entrance, have to have this parking. Everything makes it complicated. Years ago, there was people living upstairs and there was no issues. Yes, we have to work forward with it, but in a case where we can actually get people to live over buildings. And again, it goes back to the list of buildings that's saying you can't touch that ceiling now, but you have to fireproof it. But you can't fireproof it because there's a commercial business underneath it. You're not allowed to touch it. I've witnessed the first time myself where we stood in a room and 3 weeks eventually they allowed us to take down the ceiling. The building was held up for 3 weeks over taking down the ceiling to structurally hold up the building. So planning laws have an awful lot to do with it, but from the point of view of community. And I looked on it, I'm actually delighted to see there's a great mix of ages here today, which is great. But the youth, all up along line is key. And we've got to make something fun for the younger generation to get involved. They will get involved and give them something small to do. And just have them incorporated. They don't want to go to meetings, they want give them small projects and have the adults working with them. You'll just see that there'll be an awful uptake, but the communication between all the different groups has to happen. There has to be equal ground, mutual ground, that they actually the three of them take on one project together, even a small project, the three of them work together on one small project, and then they can do their other. But just join them on one and just see how they go.
Just on that, Richard, we actually did a workshop in Tipperary during Heritage Week, with the children to sort of find out what do you like about your buildings in your town, traditional buildings. I mean, I'm not a purist, so I just want to say that from the start. And then actually 3 weeks ago we had a workshop for owners of vacant properties, say like what's your blockage, what do you need from us? And I mean, it's really interesting because one of the things that they told us obviously was design guidance. They wanted a one-stop shop. They felt they couldn't go anywhere in terms of, they just talked to the fire officer, the planner, the vacant homes officer, just this whole, too many people. So we need these one-stop shops. But fundamentally they were talking about finance, and it's really interesting that you're, John, obviously that's your background. So they were sort of saying, the grants are for social housing, but what if you want to do private rentals? So, we have to try and look at what about the backlands? Can that be brought in as hope value? As you say about the traditional buildings, for me, a protected structure with a tree growing out the chimney is not a protected structure. So we need to sort of stop being perverse about saying that these buildings, for me, it's better to have a family in it, to have a business in it. But we must look at the land out the back as well. So, John, do you have any thoughts from your finance?
Yeah.
How we...
Well, there's a couple of things, because I do got buildings in the city centre as well, right? So, and if you try and compare things in Ireland to towns I know in Europe that have worked better, right? So we have, people have maybe seen some of the stats recently about car ownership in Ireland, right? So we actually are behind many European countries in car ownership, but way ahead of most of them in car dependency, right? Because since Henry Ford or wherever it was decided we moved from, and I spent my summers going to Arte, so I went first, believe it or not, actually carrying kind of milk to the creamery from Clash to Arte in sort of a horse-drawn carriage, then a tractor, and eventually became a car, right? over, and I am that old, right? But that has changed fundamentally the dynamics of Irish towns compared to the financing issues and stuff like that, and other European cities or towns, right? And the key ingredient in ones that work is a combination of a carrot and a stick. It's a disincentive to allow people to want to choose the green field to actually build a house, but it's a carrot to make them want to be in the town. And we've kind of tended to only have the stick, we've forgotten about the carrot, right? And the ultimate carrot comes from the fact that when you decide where I want to live and sleep tonight, it makes more sense for you to be in that urban, because actually towns are urban, in that urban environment than having to get back in the car to drive home, or driving backwards and forwards to get the 2 bags of groceries or whatever. And most importantly, because there is a huge economic advantage to a family that certainly doesn't need a second car and may not even need a first car. When we did the analysis for Colbert, which is inside town, the idea of making that a carless zone in Limerick would have generated billions of euros of savings. Anybody living in Colbert trying to buy an apartment there that had decided for the next 20 years we don't need a car because we're actually in the city centre could have afforded 150,000 euros more in a mortgage. 150,000 more in a mortgage to buy an apartment. Well, it might be an extra room that they're buying because they're buying a bigger place. And the trade-off is the car. And we don't count those trade-offs in Ireland. But fundamentally, in towns I've seen work really well in European, in the continental environment, they are ones that are really great places to right-size to when you get to sort of the end of work and you're not commuting backwards and forwards. You want to live there because you can walk to the cafe, you can walk to the little market, you can live effectively within an area where you walk and you're back in the community, as opposed to living in a house in isolation in another place and being dependent on neighbours to drive you here, there and everywhere. And if we can achieve that with the definitions of our towns in these plans, the premium becomes living in the city centre, the town centre, or even the village centre. And that means that when the people look for financing to restore these zones, which are more expensive than building, the value of what they have at the end, having done the restoration, is actually higher, which means that they can get more financing. And right now, and I don't know Brough well enough, but if I take Limerick for example, it is perverse that the city centre of Limerick is the cheapest housing in Limerick, which makes it impossible to actually borrow the money to do up the houses in Limerick that are the most expensive. Right? Now, the other perversion that's in the system at the moment, to my great frustration, is the involvement of the public sector in housing and what they're doing. So there's an example on Mallow Street, which I found recently, where the state gave effectively 2 buildings for 10 euros to an approved housing body, which is borrowing from the state over €1 million to do up each one of those buildings. Now, I don't know anybody in this room that could go, well, first of all, the state wouldn't give them the house for a tenner, even if they were doing it up in the main street of Brough. There's nobody can go to the state to say, even if it's going to cost me €1 million to comply with all of these rules that are there, that I can actually borrow €1 million for something that at the end of that process is probably going to be worth 600,000 maximum. Right? And of course, because the state is doing that, it is skewing the whole system. I think I saw recently that Limerick has to deliver 500 social houses a year for the next number of years. And they are targeting mainly the acquisition of houses built outside of, let's say, the social authority system of Limerick. Which is, of course, completely crazy, because that's putting first-time buyers out of the market. It's rising those prices against all of the others that want to do it. Whereas what the council should be doing is committing, even if they can't start it this year or next year, to a building programme that actually adds more houses and more apartments into the system to meet those deadlines. And they have the ability, which developers will not be doing, of putting that housing exactly where it works best, go back to the planning point, to redevelop the towns of Limerick, to redevelop the city of Limerick. And there are all these pieces, and again, I go back to this devolution of power, right? For me, the reason, and I didn't notice this before when I was in government, but it became obvious to me afterwards, it's like the HSE without the regional authorities, right? The reason is that if you think about the way we set up the country in Ireland, if you're going to have a row between housing and health or transport or anybody else, the only person in our entire system of Ireland that can adjudicate on that row is the teacher. Because all of these systems funnel all the way up without ever interacting properly to one person. And so the reason for me to absolutely, and I do agree that the systems are more dynamic in continental Europe, is because there is locally somebody elected by the people, whether it's in that town or whether it's in that department in France or wherever, who is responsible to the people in that area for all of these issues. And so when there is a row between housing and transport or something's happening that doesn't make any sense, there is a woman or there is a man elected and accountable to the public in that area who actually has to make that decision. And so if there's a plan that has been developed in Bruff that hasn't been activated, or maybe a piece of it hasn't been activated or needs funding, they don't have to try and send poor Richard here and Patrick and Niall up to Dublin to try and negotiate to get that activated for the council. There's somebody locally who is responsible for doing that, and the reason that they act more quickly is because if they're not acting quickly, they're turfed out of office the next time around that there's an election. And that's where we have a structural issue in Ireland that really needs a lot of looking at. And again, why I thought that the DEM with the powers of all this made way more sense. Because that person who adjudicates this, who makes those decisions, housing alone won't solve growth, you'll need transport, you'll need health, and that person needs to be locally able to move the levers, or at least to advocate to the right people about it.
Okay, I think we're near.
Sorry, I own a business there on Main Street, which would have been a derelict building, and my background would also be in construction due to training, but I run a tourism business. And as a person on Main Street, I mean, firstly to the councillors and independent councillors, I admire you, and I also admire Biddy here. But our fundamental problem in this town is our local area development plan. It was brought in 2012, it was meant to, 2016, it was meant to be viable till 2018. It has been extended to 2022. The plan had no real, backbone to it. The council itself didn't believe in it. They spoke about distributor roads, they spoke about loads of things, but yet they gave planning permission to farmers to put up slatted units on distributor roads. They zoned areas of land that were landlocked because these distributor roads would never go ahead. Now, I got a preview of another local development plan that could go ahead, and yet there is no vision in it. There is fantasy in it, but there is no vision in it. There is no talks of opening up the back roads to properties on Main Street to allow families to live on properties on Main Street. At the moment, being the only person with an opening on Main Street and access to their own backyard, living on Main Street is not viable, because if you are a young family and you're even going to live upstairs, you can't park outside your premises. You can't get into your premises. We're landlocked on Main Street. There is no talks of opening up a street to unlock Main Street. It is possible to do it if anybody looked at Google Maps. So constantly, Bruff is being provided with a local area development plan that will never go anywhere, because it is not looking at the basics to get it right in the first place. When I was chairperson below the school 4 years ago, we had 307 students. It is now down to 246. Why? Because everything and anything that is being zoned has come out of the zoning process because the planning permission is up, or it's landlocked and it's not going ahead. The only thing that can go ahead in this town is possibly 22 units for social housing. There is people in this town who need housing now, and they can't get it. And yes, we are looking at a high percentage of derelict properties on Main Street. Why? Because it's not a nice place to live in, and because the council is not fixing the problem in opening up the backlands to Main Street to make it a viable option to be able to pull into the back of your property. I hear about there's no finance available for Bruff. When I left my previous business before I went to Main Street, the local taxes on that property tax was 6,000. The following year, my son now is 10, in 2013, that jumped up to straight to 16,000. The other large premises in the town also saw a 10 grand increase that year. In the 3 years that followed, 74,000 was taken out in extra local property taxes from business people on Main Street. And we're wondering why another business closed their doors this week. The money has been taken out of the town. The development plan is not being got right. It's not being opened up to allow new families to come in, and the town is dying. And the next local area plan is still wrong.
Just to answer that, yeah, I mean, what we're finding, or what I'm finding with the programme that I've set up now, the local area plans, I've actually just reviewed 14 LAPs for 15 of the towns, so one town doesn't have a local area plan. But I mean, for example, just what you're saying there about those plans, so, you know, if I give you the example in Dundalk, sorry, just to sort of throw it out there. So there's a plan for Dundalk, which has a population of 40,000 roughly. Their plan has not been updated since 2009. And it had absolutely no data in it. It had no appreciation of the backlands, just as you're saying. That's what I'm working with, the Dundalk Business Improvement District, okay, the BID. And it's just really, I think you mentioned the word perverse, and I mean, that's really what I'm seeing in the systems, and they're quite weak systems. They're not robust systems like in European countries. So like, I couldn't agree more with you, and I mean, as somebody who loves planning is meant to enrich people's lives. That's why I was asking you that question, you know, what's your experience of planning? Because as I say, as somebody who is looking at the planning system and saying this isn't working anymore, and also the plans are not being, they're not creative enough, they're not updated frequently, and also those 14 LAPs, not one of those LAPs had any data on vacancy, not one of those 14 LAPs had any information on sustainable development goals. So thank you. I mean, I hear your voice very clearly, okay, and it's just really, really interesting. So I would just say to you, your LAPs in this country, they need to be better. We need to look at the backlands, and that's why we're finding that we're completely out of kilter with the European stats.
I find Rough is being led to suffer at the hands of Kilmallock. Kilmallock has been known as a town at disadvantage, and because they're a disadvantage, the funding is being put into Kilmallock, and any resources coming into the area is being diverted to Kilmallock the whole time. Now, we had a population of 843, or somebody else might want to correct me on this. Our population has grown by 50% in the last 12 weeks, we take it. There's no resources coming into town, there's no more transport links coming into town. But I'm looking at all these transport links going through via Tipperary, no offence to Tipperary or anywhere else, and going back West Limerick and everything else, but there's nothing else coming in here to Brough. You know what I mean? We have a new sewage systems down there that has been updated. The town can take more houses, but the way the local area plan is being done, it's nearly intentional to keep Brough stagnant. And while we keep Brough stagnant and we don't allow new developments into the town, our school is going to lose teachers. And it has a knock-on effect. The more people that come into Brough, into our schools and into other businesses, that creates footfall. The footfall in town is falling all the time. Now, I work in tourism, and it is considered a bed and breakfast, and it is quite a large bed and breakfast. We've just come out of COVID. During COVID, bed and breakfasts did not get any support from the Irish government. The hotels did. There is one hotel in the country that made 100,000 profit during COVID because of the amount of resources and grants it got. B&Bs did not get any. As a result, and this is a big thing back in Adair, which you're actually going to see. There was 13 B&Bs back in Adair. There is only 2 open today. 11 have closed. They haven't opened up because they did not get the support. Each one of those B&Bs possibly had an average of 6 rooms per night. Okay? That's 66 room nights gone out of that area per night now. That is going to have a really negative effect on the restaurants back in Adair, and you will see them closing because the footfall has gone out of the town. I have people coming into this town now and the resources aren't there for them. I used to have 2 cafes and 2 restaurants. I am down to 1 restaurant that has limited opening hours, which has a negative effect on my business. So while the footfall may be coming into town, the resources are now gone because there's other industries gone. And I will see very shortly in Adair, I can see a whole load of restaurants closing back there because the footfall is gone out of Adair. But on the short term, they're going to have the resources.
Sorry, just on the local area plans, People might have seen it, the data is a big thing that's not actually on the local area plan. They recently done a local area plan for the Derrick district on Rackhill, and the local area plan was to be adopted. And I have a brother actually, that's a councillor back there, and I actually was feeding them information into the meeting at the time. They put people's houses and land into floodplain, even though the maps have the maps and the data on the maps haven't been updated. So we had to get people to do topical surveys at a cost to themselves to see could they get their houses out of a flood zone, to show that the maps, that the OPW maps, which are measured from Malin Head, is where they take their measure from, shows that the actual place that they had under flood were actually not in flood. But the knock-on effect of that is, and it goes back to what you were saying within the local authority, they've got a template. They don't know how to move or deviate from the template. So if they start the process, the template is there. They can't deviate off it. They just keep going on and on until it gets to process, until it comes to a big legal battle or something happens. And that's where the local area plans go. From the point of view of link roads, 100%. You look at Croom and your husband is in Croom and has a business in Croom. Only for the access that he has there into where his shop is, only for the little road around the back of it from apartments, and the other side of you coming in by the back of stores. Those little link roads give people to their backyards so they can actually live on the main street and work on the main street. Rough doesn't have that. Kilmallock does, Rough doesn't. So it is 100% something that's been looked at. On your infrastructure part of them, you said yes, the increase on population in Rough. And I've looked at that and I went back to Megan and said we need another bus service within here because of the influx of people coming into here and is up. There's not a lot of those people now that are in the centre actually working in different areas that are using the bus service. Now the bus service could actually leave full here, but it's the next stop. It actually can't take any people. So the infrastructure has to be looked at. It has been raised, but it's only when things happen in this country, the likes of myself or other people have to go in and raise it, say, listen, the infrastructure is not there, and then they start to jump. But the problem here is the whole lot of the department's funding is in Dublin. It's civil servants within Dublin that have the full running of this country. It's within departmentals' eyes that they're looking at. So by what John said earlier on, the breakdown of power, as much as I'd love to see it, but when you have a department that controls everything within a Dublin, and we're trying to break it to try and get our own, I suppose, funding here, and to be responsible for our own funding here, it's going to be an uphill battle. But in the meantime, we have to deal with what we have. Long term, that's what needs to happen.
Could I just add to that? Because, just to say about the LAPs, the local area plans, so they're the statutory plans for small towns, and the threshold is 5,000. I believe the Department of Housing is looking at that. But one of the things for the LAPs, I actually just prepared a detailed policy submission for the Heritage Council, and that was submitted to Minister O'Brien in September on the LAP guidelines. Okay, so there's what is called Section 28 guidelines, so they're the sort of Bible in the local authorities for the planners. They have to adhere to those. So the Section 28 guidelines for local area plans were produced in 2013. So I went through those forensically, looked at the draft forensically 2012. There's actually no section in those guidelines on built environment, on the built heritage. It actually looks like somebody forgot to put it into the guidelines. So, I mean, I was quite shocked. Obviously, we're talking about towns, but as I say, in terms of the policy, where we're doing, or where it's moving is that, a few years ago with those LAPs, there was no town centre first policy. I put that into a submission for the Louth County Development Plan in 2019, said the country needs town centre first. So if we have that and we have the data, and we keep sort of, empowering communities like yourselves and trying to sort of hear your voice and facilitate, as John was saying, I'm here as a facilitator. I never tell communities what to do. I'm trying to help you. That's really what I believe in. So John, do you have any final thoughts?
Yeah, the last thought I would just mention on that is that I have no role, right? But imagine I was to sit for 5 minutes at the end of this and say, what are the 20 things that Brough needs and what is the cost of all of those? I think the answer is that somebody should have, right? The answer to that question, whether it's the back lane, whether it's something else. So that there's a clear understanding and with a proviso that it needs to be costed. And actually, I think sometimes in the system it's easier to look for a big number than a small number. It's harder to get like an extra classroom for a school than to get a whole new school, in some ways. So that it should be all put together. And the last thing that any councillors locally here will probably want to hear, right, is I think that one of the things that doesn't happen in Limerick, and maybe it doesn't happen anywhere else either, right, but it should happen, is we should have visibility on commitments that need to be done to make places work and when they're actually put in place and whether they're not put in place. So there could almost be a Brough website that says, this is what Brough needs. You know, it comes to a total of 50 million or 100 million, whatever it is, right? In order to be a town that grows at the speed at which it's growing for the next 10 or 20 years. And that's the kind of the ask. And then to the extent that it's not being delivered, it's very visible. To the extent that a councillor is able to convince a council official to do something, they get a deadline and it gets put on the website and it gets written up and exposed, because I think there is a huge amount of hiding behind non-delivery in Limerick on stuff. We've lots of plans, as you said, in Brough there were just as many for Limerick generally, and stuff that's just not happening. But when you try and look to see why it's not happening, you make this veil of fogginess, you know, that you can't see. Limerick 2030 is a company where I can't even see how much has been paid in salaries since it was set up, because they don't seem to publish their accounts. You know, so we can't compare the cost against the outcome, and yet it's got councillors and it's got council officials on the board of that, so it should be totally transparent. But I think the same thing I would recommend as a strategy, that like what Ali does, is that you have, if that is the plan that's sitting on the chair there, that somebody knows how much it costs to implement it, what you need in funding. It's very clear then for Richard or any other representative that has to go to Dublin what their ask is. And make it not about a small bridge or a footpath. And I do think in Limerick that we have a tendency to celebrate stuff that's way too small. And with the result that we miss the big picture that we're not getting. You know, or we focus on a road here and we celebrate the fact that we've got the road and we forget that we don't have any cultural facilities, we've got crap medical systems and the rest. And so because we don't have it all costed as what is the cost of driving Limerick to where it should be in 2040, 2050, in terms of all we should have, we don't have the cost of what it means to solve the problems for Brough in the context of that. If it's public transport, it's not just one extra bus because we actually have a couple more people in Brough.
It isn't just a couple more people. Our plan is outdated, outmoded by the fact that we have 350 more people planned for down the hamlet. These people are welcome, we'll do everything we can, but we don't have the services to facilitate them. We don't have the services to facilitate ourselves, not to mind, you know, so the plan has become obsolete. But any plan that has been made, council plans, every plan are now obsolete because our population is...
But then you need a new plan, right? So the point...
But you also need...
It's a very interesting debate, Ned, and we're conscious of time.
I just want to say you need a new process as well.
Sorry, no, because we are conscious of time.